In the fog-shrouded streets of medieval London, where whispers of rebellion and conspiracy floated down the Thames, a chilling method of justice emerged. The Crown, wielding its most fearsome weapon, sought to break the will of those who dared defy royal authority, the brutal sentence of being hanged, drawn, and quartered. This savage punishment, first recorded during the reign of Henry III in 1241, would become synonymous with treason, the gravest of all crimes. For the English monarchy, it was not just an offense against the king, but an affront to the very natural order ordained by God. The first known victim of this gruesome punishment was William Wallace, executed in 1241 for piracy. His death marked the beginning of a dark chapter in English legal history, where traitors were subjected to unimaginable torture as a public spectacle. The roots of high treason, however, reach back even further to the Norman conquest of 1066. William the Conqueror's feudal system demanded absolute loyalty to the crown, and even the smallest act of defiance could be considered an act of treason. William of Alderi's execution in 1076, merely for suggesting that a recently executed earl had been wrongfully killed, illustrates the harshness with which dissent was crushed. Over time, treason accusations surged, especially following the Norman conquest. The Domesday Book documented over 100 cases where traitors' lands were seized, and in 1283, the first execution by hanging, drawing, and quartering took place. Dafydd ap Gruffydd, the last independent Prince of Wales, met this fate after a long and bloody rebellion. His gruesome execution set a horrifying precedent. He was dragged through the streets of Shrewsbury, hanged alive, disemboweled, and forced to watch as his entrails were burned before his eyes. His body was then quartered, with parts sent to distant cities as a warning to others. Before the formalization of the hanging, drawing, and quartering process, traitors suffered other horrific fates. The Anglo-Saxon chronicles speak of traitors being buried alive, or worse, thrown into pits of venomous serpents. The Vikings, who had greatly influenced English justice, practiced the blood eagle, a ritual so brutal it would send shivers down the spine of even the most hardened criminals. The Normans, in turn, introduced their own brutal methods, such as the forest gallows, where traitors were hanged high above the ground so that their bodies could be seen from miles away. By 1096, a more formalized process of punishment emerged, one that combined various forms of torture and public humiliation. One particularly brutal case was that of William of Hue, who was blinded and castrated for conspiring against King William Rufus. This was a punishment that blended physical agony with psychological torment, and as time went on, this form of judicial cruelty would only become more elaborate. The formal codification of high treason as a crime came in 1351 with the Treason Act. However, the way this law was carried out varied wildly. Sir Thomas Blount, for example, was executed in 1400 in a manner that combined both disembowelment and psychological torment. He was hanged and cut down while still alive, forced to watch his own entrails being removed and burned. His last words, "Blessed be this day," became a chilling testament to his acceptance of fate. As the centuries passed, the scope of what constituted treason expanded. In 1381, during the Peasants' Revolt, John Ball was executed for preaching that social equality was God's will. His famous sermon, which asked the question, "When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman?" was seen as a direct challenge to the hierarchical system upheld by the Crown and Church alike. Religion played a crucial role in justifying the cruel punishments of the day. Influential church figures like Archbishop Stephen Langton promoted the idea of the divine right of kings, arguing that to attack the monarch was to attack God's appointed representative. One of the most poignant examples of this notion is found in the execution of Sir Thomas More in 1535. A former close advisor to King Henry VIII, More refused to acknowledge the king as the supreme head of the church. For this, he was sentenced to be beheaded. His final words, "I die the king's good servant, but God's first," remain a powerful reflection of the conflict between church and state during this turbulent period. Public executions were not only about punishment, but also about spectacle. The execution of Sir William Wallace The Scottish hero who defied English rule drew thousands to Smithfield in 1305. The execution was carefully orchestrated to ensure maximum humiliation. Wallace, who had fought for Scotland's independence, was dragged through the streets in a dramatic procession. The English chronicler Robert of Brune recorded the scene, noting Wallace's defiance even at the end, as he sang Summa is Icuman, a popular folk song, in a final act of resistance. His execution would set a precedent for the public nature of executions in the years to come. The spectacle of public execution reached its peak in the 16th and 17th centuries, but began to shift dramatically by the end of the 18th century. The gruesome process of drawing and quartering, which had once served as both punishment and a tool of royal intimidation, began to lose its place in the public consciousness as the empire slowly moved towards a new moral and judicial era in the early 1600s, when the gunpowder plot conspirators, including Guy Fawkes, were executed. Their deaths were carefully orchestrated by the authorities to send a message to anyone daring to challenge royal authority. The gunpowder plot was one of the most infamous acts of treason in English history. A failed attempt to assassinate King James I and his government, and the public execution of Fawkes and his fellow conspirators, was designed to be as much a lesson to the public as it was an act of justice. But even in the midst of this spectacle, the cruelty of the punishment began to leave a mark on the public psyche. Fawkes, despite being condemned to be hanged, drawn and quartered, cheated the executioner of a full public spectacle. By jumping off the scaffold, breaking his neck instantly, his death would be the last moment of defiance against the brutal punishment that would define the era for centuries to come. The way these executions were carried out was influenced by both symbolic and psychological factors. Public executions were designed to reinforce the power of the crown, but they also served as a means of deterrence. Anyone witnessing the grisly fate of traitors was supposed to think twice before committing treason. But in the 18th century, a growing sense of compassion began to take root within the English population with the rise of Enlightenment. Thinking a moral shift was underway, as philosophers such as Voltaire and Jeremy Bentham began to critique the brutality of executions and argue for more humane treatment of criminals. Bentham's work on the effectiveness of punishment focused on the idea that the certainty of punishment was far more effective than its severity. This marked the beginning of the end for the gruesome practice of drawing and quartering, which had once served as a symbol of the absolute power of the monarchy. The growing aversion to extreme forms of punishment was mirrored by shifts in public sentiment during the 18th century. The execution of Robert François d'Amiens in France for attempting to assassinate King Louis XVIII sparked outrage across Europe. The method of execution was remarkably similar to the English punishment of drawing and quartering, with d'Amiens being tortured for hours before being killed. The horror of his death led to widespread condemnation of such brutal methods of punishment, leading to intellectual debates on the nature of justice and cruelty. England was not immune to these changes in thought, and by the mid-1700s, public opinion on the spectacle of executions began to shift significantly. Many found the practice of hanging, drawing, and quartering to be too barbaric for a nation that prided itself on its civilization. The influence of the intellectual reformers was undeniable, as these ideas filtered into Parliament, where debates about the morality of extreme punishments began to gather momentum. In 1772, after decades of discussion, the British legal system began to slowly back away from the practice of drawing and quartering. Although the punishment remained on the books, it was no longer applied with the same regularity or to the same degree of public spectacle. It was clear that a new judicial framework was beginning to take shape. The public mood had shifted from one of morbid fascination to one of repulsion, as people grew increasingly uncomfortable with the gruesome nature of public executions. There was also a growing sense that such acts of brutality were beneath the dignity of a modern nation. During the 1800s, the philosophical debates surrounding the practice intensified, and by the mid-19th century, public executions began to be seen as increasingly anachronistic, especially when compared to the more civilized methods used elsewhere in Europe. The death penalty remained legal in England, but the methods used to carry out executions had evolved. The shift from public executions to private hangings marked a dramatic change in how death was viewed in the public sphere. the last public hanging. At Tyburn took place in 1783, and the shift to Newgate Prison marked the beginning of the end for the bloody public spectacles that had once been a fixture of English life. Despite the abolition of the drawing and quartering sentence, the debate over capital punishment was far from over in 1830, the case of William Cundell and John Smith. Raised eyebrows as the two men were sentenced to be drawn and quartered for coining offences. However, public outcry led to their sentences being commuted to hanging, instead a significant turning point. The case of William Orsini in 1858 proved to be the final blow to the practice of drawing and quartering. Orsini had been convicted of attempting to assassinate Napoleon III of France, and the public outcry over the possibility of applying such a brutal punishment to a political prisoner caused an international scandal after much debate. Orsini's sentence was commuted to hanging, and this case marked the end of the application of drawing and quartering in England. The push for reform had gained too much momentum to be stopped, and the final legislative steps came in 1858 with the passing of the Treason Felony Act. This law officially ended the practice of disemboweling and quartering as part of the punishment for high treason. And while technically still on the books, the punishment was no longer carried out in practice by the 1870s. England had moved decisively away from the use of such extreme punishments. The final abolition of drawing and quartering came in 1870 with the Forfeiture Act and the Treason Felony Act, marking the end of an era when public executions were seen as both a form of justice and a spectacle for public entertainment. The philosophical shift toward more humane forms of punishment mirrored the broader changes taking place in society as industrialization progressed. So too did attitudes toward crime and punishment. The death penalty continued to be debated and eventually abolished in the 20th century. But the legacy of drawing and quartering remained as a grim reminder of a darker past. It stood as a symbol of the extent to which power had been wielded by the monarchy over the lives and deaths of its subjects. Public opinion on executions continued to evolve, and by the late 19th century executions had become private affairs held behind closed doors, in stark contrast to the public spectacles of previous centuries. With the advent of prison reform and the rise of the penitentiary system, the focus shifted from punishment to rehabilitation and reformation. The final vestiges of medieval justice gave way to a new era of legal reform, where the focus was on the dignity of the individual and the pursuit of justice through means less barbaric than those that had come before. This transformation in English law was not without its critics, but the move away from hanging, drawing, and quartering marked a turning point in the history of punishment in England, an era where torture and spectacle gave way to more civilized notions of justice and human rights. The memory of the gruesome executions of the past still lingers in the minds of those who study the darker chapters of English history, but they serve as a reminder of how far society has come in the quest for justice and the respect of human dignity.